Welcome to Plainfield, Wisconsin, a town that used to mean nothing more than long winters, quiet roads, and the hum of tractors rolling through endless fields. But in 1957, that quiet changed forever. Snow fell that November like powdered glass, coating the barns and telephone lines in silence. People said the air felt different that week, sharp, metallic, heavy with something no one could name. The butcher's dog howled all night. Crows gathered on the frozen fence posts, staring at a single farmhouse at the edge of the woods. That was Ed Gein's place. To outsiders, Ed was just another lonely farmhand, thin, soft-spoken, polite to a fault. He fixed fences, shoveled driveways, and sometimes babysat for the neighbors. He laughed nervously like a man afraid his own voice might break something. No one suspected what lay behind the warped wooden door of his kitchen. They said his light never went out, a bare bulb glowing through the frost like a watchful eye. And sometimes, if the wind was right, a strange smell would drift down from the Gein farm. Not manure, not smoke, something older, something human. On the morning of November 16, 1957, Bernice Worden, the owner of the local hardware store, vanished. Her son, Deputy Frank Worden, found the store empty, the cash register gone, and a streak of blood trailing out into the snow. The last receipt she'd written that day said antifreeze Ed Gein. By sunset, Sheriff Arthur Schley and two deputies were driving down the dirt road toward Ed's property. The farmhouse sat alone on 50 acres of dying corn windows, boarded roof sagging, every inch of it swallowed by darkness. They knocked, no answer. They pushed open the barn door, and what they saw inside would stain the memory of Plainfield forever. Bernice Worden's body hung upside down from a rafter, dressed like a deer from hunting season. Her torso opened, emptied, and yet that was only the beginning. Inside the house, officers found a catalog of horror no imagination could invent: chairs upholstered with human skin, bowls made from skulls, a lampshade stitched from flesh, a belt woven from what used to be women, masks, faces preserved, dried, and painted with lipstick hanging on the wall like trophies. In the kitchen sink, a human heart. On the stove, a pot simmering, its contents unrecognizable. Sheriff Schley dropped his lantern that night, and for years afterward he would wake screaming, swearing he still smelled that house. After the arrest, Plainfield became a ghost of itself. The cafe closed, the school shut its doors early, and for the first time people started locking their houses. Old farmers whispered that the soil on Gein's property wouldn't grow anything anymore, that it had tasted too much death. Children dared each other to walk down the road past midnight and listen for the sound of sewing from inside the boarded house. Some said you could still see a shadow moving behind the curtains long after Ed was gone. Others claimed the snow that fell on that land never melted, it just turned gray year after year. The town pastor refused to say his name in sermons. And when the wrecking crew finally came to tear the farmhouse down in March of 1958, people said the fire burned too fast, as if the place had been waiting to destroy itself. Only the chimney remained standing crooked against the winter sky, like a gravestone with no name. In the months that followed, psychologists would call Ed Gein a case study of isolation and delusion. Born in 1906, raised by a mother who preached sin and damnation, he grew up believing the world outside was corrupt. After her death, he began reading medical books and anatomy manuals, fixating on the female form as something both sacred and forbidden. He robbed graves, digging up bodies of women who reminded him of Augusta, his mother dressing their remains, speaking to them as if they were still alive. When that no longer satisfied him, he went looking for the living. He told investigators later, I don't remember how many, maybe 9. He smiled when he said it, not out of pride, but confusion, as though counting wasn't the point. To him, the line between the living and the dead had simply worn away. He wasn't killing, not in his mind. He was collecting, preserving, keeping his mother's voice alive in the only way he knew how. Even now, decades later, people say the fog over Plainfield carries her name, Augusta. Augusta. They say on cold nights when the wind crosses the fields, you can hear it brush against the old fence line where the Gein place used to stand. Some hear a low humming, like someone sewing or whispering hymns. Others swear they've seen a figure in the distance, a man wearing someone else's face, walking slowly toward the light of a single bulb. Every small town has a legend, but Plainfield's legend was real, too real. The police reports are still there, locked in metal cabinets sealed under the Wisconsin State Archives. Photographs so disturbing that most have never been released to the public. Notes scribbled in the margins. Face mask, female unknown. Chair material, human epidermis. And beneath them one line written by Sheriff Schley himself. This man has made hell his home. To this day, historians argue whether Ed Gein was a killer, a madman, or something else, a mirror of the darkness every small town hides beneath its snow. Because when you strip away the frost, the church bells, and the neat white fences, you realize Plainfield wasn't just his home. It was the perfect place to disappear and to make sure others did too. November 16th, 1957, the day the snow turned red. Sheriff Arthur Schley had seen death before. He'd worked farms in the Depression, pulled bodies from wrecks along Highway 73, even handled suicides when winter loneliness got too deep. But what he saw that night in Plainfield, he said no man could walk away from unchanged. The report began simple enough. Missing person, Bernice Worden, female, age 58. Last seen at Worden's Hardware, Plainfield, Wisconsin. Suspect Edward Gein. But behind that line was a trail of horror so deep it swallowed the town's innocence whole. The deputies parked in front of the Gein farm just after dark. The temperature had dropped below freezing. The wind bit through their coats like razors. They saw no smoke from the chimney, no movement, only that single yellow bulb glowing through the frost. When they opened the barn door, the light swung, and what it revealed didn't belong to any world they knew. Bernice Worden hung from the rafters, headless, her body dressed and gutted like a deer. The ground beneath her was frozen but still glistened wet. Her heart lay in a paper bag near the stove. Later reports listed slashing wound to the throat and decapitation post-mortem. Sheriff Schley gagged, stumbled outside, and vomited into the snow. He told his deputy, "God help us, this ain't human work." But it was, and it was only the beginning. The house itself was worse than any nightmare. Every step creaked like the floorboards were breathing. The first room was the kitchen. On the table, a human skull used as a bowl. On the wall, faces, literally faces, tacked and stretched like parchment. In the pantry, a box filled with bones neatly labeled. In the bedroom, a lampshade stitched from flesh. A chair padded and sewn in strips. A belt made from nipples. The sheriff's report page, 3 line 8, read simply, "Article mask, female human skin tanned. Number found 9. 9. Each one identified later as belonging to women, missing from the area: Mary Hogan, the tavern keeper who'd vanished in 1954. A woman from the nearby cemetery missing since 1949. Others, never named. The medical examiner said the skin had been preserved carefully, as if by a craftsman or a worshiper. They found Augusta's room, Ed's mother's, sealed tight, untouched since 1945. Furniture polished, Bible open on the table, dust thick as velvet. No cobwebs dared to grow there. In contrast, Ed's own room looked like a mausoleum of obsession boxes of old pulp magazines, Death Cult's Human Anatomy, True Detective, photographs of Nazi experiments torn from medical books, and on the nightstand a pair of lips drawn tight with string like a coin purse. When questioned later, Ed said quietly, "I was making a woman's suit, so I could be my mother again." He said it without trembling, without malice, as if explaining how to fix a fence. The interrogation began that same night. Detectives from the Wisconsin State Crime Lab drove through the blizzard to question him. He sat in a small bare room at the Waushara County Jail, hands folded, head down, eyes almost gentle. He didn't deny anything, he just talked, softly like a child reciting a story he'd already told himself 1,000 times. He said he dug up graves sometimes 2-3 nights a week. Always women who looked like Mother. He'd read their obituaries in the paper, wait a few days, then go to the cemetery with a shovel and lantern. He said the ground was easy in springtime. He'd take what he needed, parts he called them, and sew them together. When asked about Mary Hogan, he smiled faintly. "She's not missing," he said. "She's at the house." The files, 1957-1958. The Wisconsin Bureau of Criminal Investigation cataloged every item. They filled more than 200 evidence bags, human skulls whole and partial, organs in jars, masks, furniture, bones used as utensils. They even found a box of fingernails, clean, sorted by size. The official inventory, dated December 4th, 1957, reads, "Chair upholstered human skin, bull skull human, mask female 9, corset made from torso of female, heart human, lampshade human skin." Each entry stamped source Ed Gein, residence Plainfield, Wisconsin. Newspapers from Chicago to Los Angeles picked up the story. Headlines screamed, "House of Horror found in Wisconsin farm, real-life ghoul caught in Midwest." The Associated Press called it the most shocking discovery in American criminal history. After the arrest, the town went silent. Reporters came by the dozens, but locals refused to talk. They closed curtains, turned away. Some buried family graves twice over, fearing Ed had touched them. Kids dared each other to sneak up the road at night. One claimed he saw a light in the ruins swinging back and forth like a lantern. Another said he heard laughter coming from under the ground, thin, soft, almost polite. When the farmhouse burned down the following spring, no one called the fire department. They just watched from the distance, faces lit orange by the flames. A reporter asked one farmer why no one helped put it out. He said, "We didn't want it to stay standing." To this day, people in Plainfield swear that when the snow falls thick and the wind comes down from the north, you can still smell that house. A mix of leather smoke and something sweet. Something wrong. Ed was declared legally insane in 1958 and committed to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane in Waupun. Doctors diagnosed him with schizophrenia and psychosis. They said he had no concept of death, only transformation. When asked if he regretted anything, he blinked once, then said, "I don't know if I did wrong. Mother would know." He stayed institutionalized for 27 years. In 1984, he died quietly of cancer, age 77. No family, no funeral, just a cardboard box buried in the same cemetery where he'd once dug up his collections. People vandalized his grave so many times the caretakers finally removed the marker. Now only a patch of grass remains unmarked, unvisited. But locals say if you stand there long enough, the soil shifts slightly, as if something beneath it is remembering. Every generation in Wisconsin seems to have a new story about Ed Gein. Some say he haunts the old road where the farmhouse once stood. Some swear the furniture built from flesh was never destroyed, just hidden away in a basement collection somewhere waiting. There's a rumor that the lampshade surfaced once at an estate auction in Illinois, mislabeled as antique hidework. No one knows if it's true. Maybe it's better that way. Because stories like this don't really end, they sink into the land. And in towns like Plainfield, the land remembers everything. The morning after Ed Gein's arrest, Plainfield woke to the sound of nothing. No engines, no chatter at the cafe. Even the church bell stayed still, frozen in the wind. Only the crows moved, circling above the Gein farm dark spots against the white Wisconsin sky. The sheriff's car sat abandoned on Main Street mud, frozen up to the fenders. Inside the station, men who'd worn the same uniform for 20 years sat in silence, staring at their coffee like it might explain something. Someone muttered, "He used to shovel my driveway." Another said, "He fixed my fence." Every man in that room realized they'd shaken hands with him. Some had eaten at his table. That was the real horror of it, not just what Ed did, but that nobody had ever seen it coming. Sheriff Arthur Schley was never the same. The doctors said it was nervous exhaustion. The men at the diner said he'd lost his mind out there. He'd wake screaming at night, convinced he still smelled that house. His wife said he'd open all the windows even in January just to breathe air that wasn't tainted. A reporter from Life magazine tried to interview him in December. Schley lasted 10 minutes before breaking down. He said, "I dropped my lantern, and for a second I thought the shadows on the wall were moving, but they weren't shadows." A month later, he was admitted to the state hospital, the same one that would later house Ed. He died in 1968 from a heart attack, still insisting that the smell never left his hands. At the hardware store, Bernice Worden's son closed the shutters and never reopened. The building stood vacant for decades, its windows clouded with dust, the faint outline of the store's name still visible like a ghost in the paint. Across town, old Mrs. Keene said she remembered seeing Ed at the grocery store 2 days before the arrest. "Polite as ever," she said. "He carried my bag to the car, and when I thanked him, he said, 'Mother would have wanted me to.'" That sentence, "Mother would have wanted me to," became a kind of curse in Plainfield. People whispered it under their breath when something bad happened. When a cow gave stillbirth, when the snow came too early, when a dog barked at nothing in the cornfields. It was as if her name, Augusta, still ruled the town through him. Reporters descended on Plainfield like vultures. By early 1958, the town's only cafe was full of men with cameras asking the same question: what was he like? One waitress, Lila, told them he'd sit right there by the window, same booth every week, ordered black coffee, no sugar, never touched pie, just sat quiet, looking out. Sometimes I'd catch him smiling at something that wasn't there. When the journalists pressed her, she shook her head and said, "You could tell he was lonely, but we all were." They never quoted that line. It didn't fit the story they wanted. There was a man named Earl Peterson, a farmer whose land bordered the Gein property. In an interview from 1960, he said that sometimes in the years before the arrest, he'd hear voices late at night, not shouting, not singing, just talking, like a conversation between two people. He thought Ed had company, maybe a girlfriend from out of town. But after the arrest, he realized the voices had only ever come when the wind blew from the south, from the direction of the old cemetery. He swore that on one winter night, he saw candlelight moving between the headstones. He told his wife the next morning. She told him never to repeat it. When the interviewer asked if he still heard the voices, Earl said no. "But sometimes when I walk that fence line, I feel like I'm being measured." Plainfield shrank after that winter. Families moved away, saying they couldn't stand the way people stared. Tourists began driving in from Chicago just to see the killer's house. Local kids charged $1 to point out the dirt road. Men at the tavern would tell city visitors, "It's gone now, burned down." But if you go at night, you might still smell it. The folklore spread faster than the facts ever did. People said the fire that destroyed the farmhouse started by itself, that lightning struck on a clear night, that the flames turned blue, that they heard screaming, but no one was inside. Others swore they saw a figure walking out of the blaze, a man wearing a woman's face, vanishing into the snow. None of that made the police reports, of course, but in Plainfield, truth and rumor became the same thing. A young reporter named Paul Houston from the Milwaukee Journal kept a notebook during the case. He visited Plainfield 3 times that winter, and in his final entry he wrote, "It's the silence that gets you. Even the snow seems afraid to fall too loud. You can feel the whole town holding its breath like it's waiting for him to come back." Houston later left journalism. He said the story had followed him home. His wife claimed he started locking every door at sunset and kept a crucifix in every room. Years later, a new generation grew up on those same roads. They never met Ed Gein, but they inherited his shadow. They said the soil at the edge of the old property was sick, that grass wouldn't grow there, that every spring before the thaw, something black oozed from the ground like tar. And sometimes the snow there smelled faintly of perfume. Hunters refused to camp nearby. Truckers avoided the route at night. And even now, some swear that when fog rolls over the field, you can see faint outlines of furniture as if the house still stands in another world. Property values dropped by half. Plainfield stopped hosting its annual harvest fair. Tourists came not to buy corn, but to ask for directions to the house. In the 1960 census, the population fell below 700. By the 1970s, most of the original families had gone, but the name remained a stain that couldn't be washed off. In 1978, a university psychology professor interviewed former residents for a study on community trauma. One woman said, "It wasn't what he did that ruined us. It was what he proved, that you never really know who your neighbor is." Every small town has a story it keeps buried. But Plainfield refuses to stay quiet. Truckers still report radio interference when they drive past the old site. Static like a heartbeat. Sometimes the signal breaks long enough to whisper a name, Augusta. Paranormal groups come every year setting up cameras and recorders hoping to capture something. Most leave with nothing but frostbite. But one recording made in 1998 picked up what sounded like humming. A man's voice, soft, gentle, singing a hymn. Locals say it was Ed, others say it was the wind. Either way, they stopped listening after that. Even the children who were there in '57 grew old with it. Some never left the county, but they built fences higher than anyone else's. They taught their kids not to trust the quiet ones, not to walk home alone after dark, not to answer if someone knocked on the door past midnight. They say trauma becomes part of the land. And in Plainfield it did. There's a hill overlooking the old Gein property. If you stand there at dusk, you can see the line of trees that once marked the driveway. There's nothing left now, no barn, no house, no sound, but every winter. When the wind comes from the north, you can hear something moving through the snow. Not footsteps, not quite wind, something in between. And if you listen long enough, it sounds like sewing. The files were locked away, but the story refused to stay buried. In the winter of 1958, Wisconsin became a word whispered like a curse. Reporters camped outside the courthouse in Wautoma. Photographers fought for a glimpse of the man who had built furniture from the dead. But when Ed Gein finally walked past them, head down, thin hands, folded eyes, empty, the flashbulbs caught nothing monstrous at all. He looked ordinary, frighteningly ordinary. That was what unsettled everyone. Because if he looked like any farmer on any back road, then what did that say about the rest of them? The Wisconsin Bureau of Criminal Investigation spent months cataloging the evidence. 3 entire barns on the state fairgrounds were requisitioned to hold it. Each artifact tagged, photographed, measured. Each photograph sealed under restricted material. Agents noted Gein's calm cooperation. He gave directions to every grave he'd robbed, every cemetery he'd entered. He drew maps from memory rows of crosses, dates, even the approximate depth of the coffins. He could recall every woman's name. When asked why, he said, "I wanted to bring them home." The official psychological report, dated February 1958, describes him as emotionally arrested at age 10, driven by delusional guilt and maternal fixation. He didn't fit the profile of a sadist or predator. He was something rarer, a man who tried to reconstruct love out of death. The report concluded, his actions appear to stem not from cruelty, but from an absence of boundary between life and decay. Detective Joe Wilimowski, one of the first on scene, said later, "It wasn't a crime scene, it was a museum. Everything had meaning to him. He kept the notebooks from those nights until he died. In the margins, he wrote fragments that still haunt cold case seminars today. Smell doesn't leave wood. Silence has weight. He was polite when we cuffed him. At the state crime lab in Madison, technicians handled the items like relics from another civilization. One wrote in his log tanned material unusually soft, possibly female, stitched by hand double thread. Another added, "We stopped after the 5th box. Couldn't keep eating lunch." None of them forgot the smell. When the official investigation ended, the legend began. The newspapers called him the Ghoul of Plainfield. Radio hosts turned him into a monster of the Midwest half-man, half-myth. But in taverns and truck stops across Wisconsin, the story took on another tone. People said the land itself had gone sour, that the ground around the Gein farm refused to thaw for 3 winters straight, that birds wouldn't nest there, that one deputy's hair turned white overnight after opening the icebox. None of it appeared in the case files, but everyone in town believed at least one of those tales, and once a story like that takes root in American soil, it never dies. Ed's trial began in November 1958, 1 year after the discovery. Reporters filled every seat. Curious locals stood outside in parkas and boots, watching history happen through frosted glass. The proceedings lasted less than 2 weeks. The defense pleaded insanity. The prosecution agreed he was found guilty but insane and remanded to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane, later transferred to Mendota. The judge Robert H. Golmar wrote years later in his memoir, "He was the mildest defendant I ever tried. The courtroom expected evil, but what they saw was emptiness." After the verdict, reporters asked if Gein understood what had happened. He said, "Mother would be happy I'm safe now." That was the last sentence anyone heard him speak in public. The state ordered the destruction of most physical artifacts, but rumors persisted that not everything was burned. A few pieces misplaced before incineration, a chair, a lampshade, a box of photographs. In 1958, the Gein property was auctioned, scheduled for March 30th. Bidders came from across the Midwest hoping to buy souvenirs. But in the early hours of the 20th, a fire consumed the house. Witnesses said the blaze lit the sky red for miles. No cause was ever proven. Deputy Sheriff Averill stated, "It saved us from a carnival." Even without the house, the carnival came. Plainfield became a destination for the curious and the macabre. Souvenir shops sold postcards that read "Home of the Ghoul." High school kids dared each other to steal dirt from the old property. Some claimed the soil whispered when they scooped it. The myth spread into American culture like a stain on a white sheet. By the 1960s, Hollywood had found it. Writers and directors reshaped the story again and again, each time sanding off the name Gein, but keeping the bones. In 1959, author Robert Bloch, who lived just 35 miles away, read about the case and wrote a novel titled Psycho. He changed Plainfield to Fairvale, Ed Gein to Norman Bates, but the seed was there, the lonely house, the mummified mother, the quiet man with the secret in the cellar. A year later, Alfred Hitchcock bought the rights. When Psycho premiered in 1960, audiences screamed not just at the shower scene, but at the realization that it came from somewhere real. Then came the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974, The Silence of the Lambs, 1991. Each film borrowed a piece of Gein's ghost, the skin masks, the obsession, the farmhouse at the edge of nowhere. And so a local crime became America's national nightmare. Detective Wilimowski, still alive in the 70s, told a journalist, "We thought we'd buried him. Turns out Hollywood dug him up again." The story spread because it fit something deep in the American imagination, the fear of the neighbor. You thought you knew the loneliness of small towns buried under snow. The church that preaches purity while darkness festers in the basement. Every state has its haunted house now, every county its man who lived alone. But Plainfield was the first, the archetype, the origin. Sociologists later called it the birth of the modern American monster. Not a vampire, not a ghost, but a man who looked like everyone else. When Ed Gein died in 1984 at Mendota Mental Health Institute, the nurses said he was polite to the end, helpful in the kitchen, fond of puzzles, never violent. He asked to be buried beside his mother. He was. And within weeks, people chipped pieces off his gravestone for souvenirs. Eventually, the marker vanished entirely. Today, his grave is unmarked, lost among hundreds in Plainfield Cemetery. The local caretaker won't say which one it is, but flowers still appear there every Halloween, plastic faded, tied with butcher's twine. Somewhere between truth and story, Ed Gein stopped being a man. He became a symbol for repression, for madness, for the thin ice under American normalcy. Professors write about him. Artists paint him. Podcasts dissect him. But in Plainfield, no one says his name after dark. A farmer who grew up nearby told a documentarian in 2005, People think the horror was what he did. The real horror is how easy it is to turn a man into a myth. The official files remain sealed, but the myth has never closed. In every retelling book movie rumor, the same image returns: a small farmhouse surrounded by snow, a single light burning through the frost, and a man inside stitching the pieces of his loneliness together. That's where the investigators left him, and where America keeps finding itself decades later, staring into that same window, wondering what lives behind its reflection. The story of Ed Gein didn't end in that farmhouse. It began there. Because what he left behind wasn't just a crime scene, it was a mirror. A cracked, frost-covered mirror America could never look away from again. In the winter that followed his arrest, newspapers called him the Butcher of Plainfield. But as months turned into years, the shock gave way to something stranger: fascination. People wanted to understand him, to name the unnameable. Psychologists, theologians, criminologists, they all came to Plainfield as if it were a shrine to human darkness. The Wisconsin State Historical Society received hundreds of letters asking for artifacts, transcripts, anything. They refused every request, but by then the legend had already escaped the archives. America had found its modern monster, and he didn't have fangs or claws. He had a pickup truck, a Bible, and a mother who never let him grow up. In the 1960s, while the rest of the country watched men walk on the moon, another kind of exploration began inward. The Ed Gein case became a template in criminal psychology. FBI profilers studying behavioral patterns in killers cited him as the origin point, not for body count, but for the mind beneath. He was the first to turn domestic space into theater of horror. The home, that sacred American idea, became unsafe. The kitchen, the living room, the mother's bedroom, all transformed into symbols of rot. Professor Harold Schechter later wrote, "Gein's crimes marked the moment when America realized evil could wear its own face. From then on, horror no longer needed castles or foreign accents or superstition. It lived in the farmhouse next door." Every small town in America carries a bit of Plainfield now. Every flickering porch light, every uncut lawn, every neighbor who keeps to himself too long. The legend became a kind of folk wisdom. You never really know what's in someone's basement. Mothers warned children not to wander off down lonely roads. Teenagers dared each other to drive into the cornfields at night, looking for the house that once was. They never found it, but they always came back saying the same thing: that for a moment the headlights seemed to hit something that wasn't there. A window, a door frame, a shadow standing still. Maybe it was just the fog. Or maybe, as the locals say, the house still stands in memory, if not in wood. By the 1970s, Ed Gein's shadow stretched across movie screens. Psycho had opened the door. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre walked through it. And by the time The Silence of the Lambs won its Oscars, the story had evolved into a national mythology: the American Gothic reborn. Each new film reinvented him: a killer, a craftsman, a caretaker, a reflection of madness wearing the mask of normalcy. And each time audiences left the theater uneasy because they recognized something of themselves in the loneliness, the obsession, the silence. Horror wasn't about monsters anymore. It was about people. It was about us. Tourists kept coming to Plainfield even decades later. They drove up Route 73 with cameras and questions. They asked for directions to the cemetery, the auction site, the burned foundation. The townspeople stopped answering. They tore down road signs. They stopped giving interviews. But curiosity has a way of digging. A rumor spread that the Wisconsin Historical Museum secretly kept one of Gein's artifacts, a belt buckle or lampshade, stored in a locked drawer. The museum denied it. But denial only made the story grow. In 2015, a collector from Illinois claimed to have bought a chair from the Gein house. He showed a photograph: cracked leather, odd stitching. Experts said it was fake. But by then the image had already circled the internet thousands of times. Every share, every retelling, another echo of that same obsession to look into the dark and find proof that it's real. When the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit formed in the 1970s, Gein's case became mandatory reading. Agents learned to trace obsession, to map delusion through domestic ritual. They called it patterned insanity. Agent Robert Ressler once said, "Gein was the seed. From him the tree grew Dahmer Bundy Kemper. He was the first whisper of a new kind of evil." But psychologists disagreed. They said Gein was never a predator. He was a scavenger, a collector, not a hunter. A man who sought comfort, not conquest. That paradox fascinated America: the idea that horror could be tender, that madness could wear politeness like a mask. And through it all, one figure lingered: Augusta, the mother. Her photograph, rarely seen, shows a stern woman in black eyes fixed like a judge's. Ed kept her room sealed for 12 years after her death. In the folklore that followed, she became something more than human: a ghost haunting her own son, a voice whispering commandments from beyond. Farmers still swear that when the snow covers Plainfield Cemetery just right, you can see two shadows on the hill, one tall, one small, both walking toward the woods. By the late 20th century, the Ed Gein case was being taught in criminology programs across the world. He became a textbook not just of crime but of cultural infection. Because what began as horror turned into myth and myth turned into mirror. A professor at the University of Wisconsin once told his students, "You can study Ed Gein as pathology, or you can study America's reaction to him as prophecy." He was right, because after 1957, the country would never again see its small towns as innocent. Every white picket fence could be hiding something. Every polite smile could conceal rot. The farmhouse had become the national subconscious. There's a saying in central Wisconsin: winter never left Plainfield. The blizzards still come early. The fields still lie empty. And on quiet nights when the wind sweeps across the frozen ground, people say you can hear a single hinge creak, the echo of a door that burned away 70 years ago. Some swear the light still glows faint and yellow somewhere out there in the dark. Others think it's just the moon reflecting off the ice. But the old men at the tavern shake their heads and say, "No, that's the lamp over his workbench. He's still sewing." For all the analysis, the films, the myths, what remains is a single truth. Plainfield was ordinary until it wasn't, and Ed Gein was human until he wasn't. He forced America to confront the unthinkable, that horror doesn't come from elsewhere. It grows here, in the loneliness, in the snow, in the silence between one heartbeat and the next. That was the true collection he left behind, not bones, not skin, not artifacts, but the realization that the boundary between normal and monstrous is paper thin. And every generation since has looked into that mirror, seeing a reflection that shifts ever so slightly closer. Today, there's nothing left of the Gein farm, just grass trees and the memory of a house that taught America how to fear itself. Tourists still stop by the road and take pictures of the empty field. They don't realize they're standing on the birthplace of a myth. Because in the end, Plainfield didn't just lose its innocence, it gave birth to ours. There's a mirror in every farmhouse, the kind with a crack down the middle, warping the reflection just enough to make you doubt what you see. For Plainfield, that mirror never healed. And in its reflection, the rest of America began to recognize itself. When the photographs from the Gein farmhouse were quietly shown in closed sessions of the Wisconsin State Court, a few jurors fainted. Reporters weren't allowed to print what they saw. But word spread, whispers, sketches, rumors, the details growing like frost on glass. Soon the name Ed Gein no longer belonged to one man. It became a phrase, a shorthand for the things America hid behind its curtains, the violence under its politeness, the rot beneath its religion, the loneliness under its progress. In a decade that celebrated chrome and neon and suburban lawns, his name reminded everyone that under the linoleum was dirt, and under the dirt were bones. Hollywood gave him masks. Authors gave him voices, psychologists gave him theories, but in the end, all they were doing was trying to dress the same wound differently. By the 1970s, every horror film carried a little piece of Plainfield's ghost. Norman Bates heard his mother's voice. Leatherface wore another's skin. Buffalo Bill danced beneath a mirror. 3 decades, 3 faces, 1 reflection. Each story more polished, more symbolic, but always reaching back to that frozen farmhouse and the man who couldn't let go of his mother. Critics called it American Gothic, but it wasn't Gothic at all. It was domestic. It was ours. Because the real fear wasn't monsters in the woods. It was the quiet man down the road, the one who smiled and said good morning. It was the idea that you could share a town, a pew, a laugh, with someone whose world had already crossed over into the dead. Drive through Plainfield today and you'll see nothing but empty fields, a few barns, and the whisper of power lines stretching toward the horizon. The house is gone. The barn is gone. The road remains. But locals say the land still remembers. Snow drifts strangely there, piling higher on the edges of the old foundation, melting slower in spring. Hunters say their dogs refuse to go near it. Teenagers still dare each other to touch the frozen soil. Some come back pale, unable to speak. Some never go back at all. At night, if you stand by the tree line, the silence is deafening. No crickets, no wind. Just the feeling that something is waiting for you to look away first. They say it's not haunted by Ed. It's haunted by what he showed them, the reflection of every secret no one wanted to see. In the decades that followed, Ed Gein became a study, a symbol, a cautionary tale. His name appeared in psychiatric journals, criminology lectures, and sociology essays. But as the academics dissected his psyche, something else happened. He disappeared. The real man with his awkward grin and soft voice was buried under layers of interpretation. In his place stood an icon, the collector, the ghoul, the skin maker. a myth polished and preserved like one of his masks. Professor Margaret Shaw from the University of Illinois once said, "We didn't bury Ed Gein, we embalmed him in story." She was right. The nation needed him, needed something to point to when it whispered, "That's where evil lives." It was easier than admitting how familiar he seemed. In small towns across the Midwest, people began telling stories that always started the same way. A man lived alone. His mother was strict. He loved her too much. And when she died, something in him broke. Every county had its own version, different names, same ending. The myth had escaped its origin and settled into folklore. Children learned not to play near abandoned houses. Wives double-bolted their doors. Husbands kept a closer eye on the neighbors who smiled too long. And somewhere deep down, a new kind of fear took root, not of the dark, but of the ordinary. Many of the men who first stepped into that farmhouse never forgot it. Their children said they rarely spoke of it, but sometimes on long winter nights they'd start drinking early and their stories would slip out like confessions. One of them, Deputy Dan Chase, was found sitting in his truck one night in 1975, staring at the field where the house once stood. When asked what he was looking at, he said, "I was waiting for the light to come on." He swore he saw it, that same faint yellow glow through the mist, flickering once, then gone. No one else did. But everyone believed him, because even for the ones who caught him, the case never really ended. It followed them home. It sat at their kitchen tables, whispering in the quiet hours. There's a story locals tell now, maybe half serious, maybe not. They say if you park your car on the old Gein Road at midnight, turn off the headlights and look in the rearview mirror, you won't see yourself. You'll see the house, standing whole, a single light on, a figure moving inside. They say the house doesn't haunt the town, it haunts anyone who looks too long into it. Because once you've stared into that mirror, it starts staring back. True crime books, podcasts, films, merchandise. Decades later, Ed Gein still sells. He's been dissected more times than any other criminal in American history. But the fascination isn't about gore, it's about recognition. The quiet farm boy who did unthinkable things feels closer than the monsters we invent. And in that familiarity, there's terror, the kind that seeps, not shocks. The realization that the monsters we fear most are not out there in the dark. They're in the same room, they're in the mirror. They say that in Wisconsin, winter is not a season. It's a test to see who can endure the silence. And maybe that's why this story was born here, where the nights last too long and every creak in the wood sounds like a memory returning. Each snowfall erases the old footprints, but somehow his never vanish. The wind carries them whispering across the fields, mothers waiting, mothers waiting. No one knows if it's just the wind or something older, the echo of a voice that never left that house. A lullaby turned sermon, a love turned curse. Imagine the last moment of Ed Gein's life. The quiet ward of Mendota Mental Health Institute, the hum of fluorescent lights, the nurse checking vitals. He looks up at the ceiling, his hands still, his face blank. He doesn't see the room. He sees the farmhouse. He hears the snow outside, the boards creaking, the voice calling him for supper. Then darkness. But maybe, just maybe, in that final instant, the mirror cracked one last time. Not in horror, in release. Because for him, the line between the living and the dead never mattered. Only the voice did. And in that voice, he found comfort. That's what makes the story unbearable. That's what makes it unforgettable. Today, America still looks into that mirror in every film, every fascination, every podcast, dissecting the human mind. We pretend to study monsters, but what we're really doing is studying ourselves. The same loneliness, the same need for control, the same hunger for understanding what cannot be understood. We build our myths from the pieces left behind, sewing them together until they resemble something human again. And when we look at them long enough, we start to see our own eyes staring back through the mask. That's the curse of Plainfield. Not that a man once did unthinkable things, but that he showed us how thin the ice beneath all of us can be. If you drive down that road today, there's nothing to see, just a field, a few trees, and the wind. But roll down your window. Listen. Sometimes the silence hums like the faint buzz of a light bulb that should have burned out long ago. Maybe it's just the power lines, or maybe somewhere, somehow, the collector is still at work. Not with skin or bone, but with memory. Because every time his story is told, every time a film or a voice whispers his name, another stitch is made, another piece added to the tapestry. And the house in Plainfield stands again. Dawn in Plainfield comes slow. The frost on the fields glows pale blue, the kind of color that looks colder than it feels. The roads are quiet again, no sirens, no reporters, no flashbulbs, just wind, always the wind. And somewhere beneath that wind, beneath decades of silence and retelling, the echo still hums, faint steady, like breath under snow. There's nothing left of the Gein farmhouse now, just grass wildflowers, a few fence posts half swallowed by soil. But the land hasn't forgotten. Every spring the grass there grows thinner, paler, as if the earth itself refuses to cover what happened. People who live nearby say they don't go that way after dark. They say headlights dim as you pass the old property line. Radios fill with static. Sometimes the air smells like burning varnish, the same scent from that March night in 1958 when the farmhouse burned and the flames reflected off the snow like blood on porcelain. No marker stands there, no sign, just emptiness and the uneasy knowledge that emptiness can hold memory better than stone. In town, the few who remain don't talk about him. The cafe rebuilt, repainted, changed its name twice. The sheriff's office has new faces now, younger, unaware, but the older deputies still flinch when winter sets in too early. At the cemetery, the groundskeeper tends the rows without speaking. Somewhere among those stones lies Ed Gein, unmarked anonymous, the most infamous man in Wisconsin, reduced to a patch of grass. But the caretaker knows. He says sometimes at dusk he sees a woman standing near that spot, long coat hands folded, face hidden by a black veil. When he looks again, she's gone. He doesn't tell the tourists. They come every Halloween with cameras and flashlights, hungry for the myth. They take pictures of the wrong grave. They leave candy pennies, scraps of paper with prayers written in trembling hands. They never stay long. The cold chases them away. Decades later, law enforcement agencies still study the Gein case, not for gore, but for understanding. His name appears in textbooks and lectures in crime databases. Yet none of that captures what the townspeople know, that the real damage wasn't what he did, but what he revealed. Plainfield became a symbol, not of horror, but of the thinness of safety, the fragile idea that the world is knowable, predictable, sane. After Gein, America stopped believing that. The case changed how police handled missing person reports, how journalists wrote about small towns, how filmmakers portrayed evil. He didn't just haunt Wisconsin, he rewrote its silence. Locals have a saying now: the wind in Plainfield doesn't whistle, it talks. They say on cold nights, if you listen long enough, you'll hear a low hum like a needle pulling through cloth. Some say it's the echo of sewing a sound left behind, not by a man, but by the act of remembering him. Others say it's just power lines trembling in the cold. But every winter someone new hears it and doesn't forget. In that way, the story survives not in museums or court records, but in sound. In the hush that falls over a room when someone mentions his name. In the pause before laughter returns. Because some stories never end, they just lower their voice. The 21st century brought documentaries, books, podcasts, each claiming to show the real Ed Gein, each promising the truth. But truth has always been the least interesting part. The fascination lies in the reflection. He was one man. The myth became millions. Every storyteller added a stitch. Every audience member leaned in closer. And somewhere between curiosity and horror, the boundary blurred, just like the one between Ed and his mother, between the living and the dead, between fact and folklore. We made him immortal not by worship, but by repetition. And every retelling brings him a little further back. The old folks in Plainfield say the snow falls thicker now than it used to. They say the winters are heavier, longer, as if something in the air resists letting go. When the first frost comes, the dogs go quiet. The barns creak even when there's no wind. One story says that on the anniversary of the arrest, a faint yellow glow appears near the old site just for a few seconds, like the flicker of a dying light bulb. Some think it's a trick of fog, others think it's a memory trying to surface. There's even a legend that if you whisper his name into the wind, it will echo back not once but twice, first as your own voice, then as hers. No one's brave enough to test it anymore. Ed Gein collected what should have stayed buried, but in the end, so did we. We've dug up his story again and again, turned it into art, into cautionary tale, into reflection. We said we were trying to understand him. Maybe we were trying to understand ourselves. Because the truth is, every society has its Plainfield, the quiet corner it pretends not to see, the silence it refuses to break. And every person carries a little of that silence somewhere inside a room, sealed off a voice that still whispers through the years. Maybe that's why we keep returning. Not to glorify him, but to ask the question no one can answer. How thin is the line between love and possession, between devotion and decay, between memory and madness? Imagine a drone shot of Plainfield today. Endless snowfields under a gray sky, the wind stirring powder into soft spirals, the faint hum of a power line cutting through the quiet. Then a dissolve. An old photograph of the farmhouse appears where the field is now. Its edges blur, fade, and the snow reclaims it. The camera pulls back. All that remains is a horizon white, cold, silent. A voice calm, distant, almost kind speaks one last line. He thought he was building a home, but what he built was a mirror, and we've been looking into it ever since. The sound fades, the screen darkens, and for a moment before the outro music begins, you can still hear it, that soft, rhythmic pull, thread through cloth. A needle in the dark, sewing memory to myth, forever.